Well, hey there and welcome back. So in this series, we're looking at the Corinthian church, and I'm looking at some of the situations that are going on there, and really just asking the question, would we do the things that they're doing? I mean, the Corinthian church has a bit of a reputation, let's just put it that way. They're always sort of seen to be the most immoral church that's ever existed, and they're doing some pretty terrible stuff that we would never do. But as I'm hoping to demonstrate, the attitude behind what the Corinthians are doing is very much on par with where we are today, because what they're doing is just human behavior. The attitudes that they're demonstrating are very human attitudes that really haven't changed at all. And really, they're attitudes that we would find in any society. And so the behaviors themselves might change somewhat, but really the thing that's behind and what drives them to do this in the first place really hasn't changed at all. So we've been looking at a few different scenarios around that. And I wanted to look at one this week, which is it's sort of a double question. It still relates to the question of, are we Corinth? But it's also asking the question, should we be more like Corinth? Should we be doing this thing that Paul seems to be advocating for the Corinthians to do? And specifically, it's this area of taking other Christians to court. So I'll start by reading the passage, and then we'll just sort of ask some questions around it as to what maybe it could mean or how it's been interpreted to mean. And then we'll put it back into its context and just see if it's anything remotely like what it is that Paul is saying. So the passage is one you might be familiar with. It's in 1 Corinthians 6:1. It says, "If any of you has a dispute with another, do you dare take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the Lord's people? Or do you not know that the Lord's people will judge the world? And if you were to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life?" So it's a pretty seemingly simple passage that would say that Christians shouldn't take other Christians to court. And I remember reading this for the first time thinking that myself, thinking, hang on a second, there should never be lawsuits in church, and there should never be any sort of criminal proceedings towards other Christians because, well, Paul said, don't take these matters before the ungodly. And so at a very basic interpretive level, that's what it would seem to mean, that we shouldn't take other Christians to court. And unfortunately, that's how it's been understood in the history of the church. And, in sort of more minor situations that may be implied here, but up into the worst possible situations where, matters of horrific crime have been committed. And the response is to say, well, no, we'll deal with that in-house. I mean, you only have to think about the way that children have been treated in the church's history, and the response being simply, no, we'll deal with those matters in-house rather than take them to the public courts, because Paul says don't take them to the public courts. And so this not only has been applied in some minor cases, but it's certainly been applied in ways that are, well, frankly, criminal. There's just simply no other way to put it, because, in fact, those are the situations that absolutely should be taken to the public courts. So what's going on here? What's happening in this passage that Paul would command this or would expect that the Corinthians actually wouldn't be doing the very thing we would expect them to do? Well, I guess here's one of those situations where we've got to be very aware of just how different our world is to the world of Paul. So we by default maybe are shocked by this passage because we would think, hang on a second, we shouldn't take them to court when we know that the court systems don't work that way. Of course we take criminal matters to court because that's where those things are dealt with. And more than that, we live in a time where we live in a society where we have a state prosecution, where we have a world where if a crime is committed, then we have a prosecutional or a judicial system that will go after the person that's committed the crime. So if somebody has murdered somebody else in your family, it's not your responsibility to go and prosecute them. It's not your responsibility to make sure they get to court, to arrest them, to charge them, and to see that their whatever charges or whatever sentence has been given, to see that gets implemented. We have a state criminal system that will do that. And so all of that is prosecuted by the state. And so it's, obviously we need to be involved in whatever the case might be as witnesses or whatever, but we have a state that will do that. Now, that's a very modern way of doing court. That's a very modern judicial system that we really take for granted. That whatever happens to us, even ideally, even if we're very low status, very poor people, that there will still be a court system or a judicial system that will protect us, that will go after the people that might have otherwise been victimizing us. But again, that's very, very new. When you go back into the context of all of human history, it's just never been that way. So when we're looking at the world of Paul, we've always got to remember that we're dealing with a 2,000-year-old world, and one that is run by the Roman Empire. So the basic rules of the Roman Empire, they're very, very simple. When Rome comes to town, they have two simple rules. They're going to occupy you, certainly, but there's only really two things that they want from you. Keep the peace, pay your taxes. That's it. Whatever else you do beyond that, entirely up to you. Worship whatever gods you want, do whatever you want, design your cities however you want, live the way that you want, carry on with your customs, whatever those customs might be, so long as they maintain the peace, which is to say, don't be an insurrectionist, don't do anything that would threaten the stability of the Roman Empire, and pay your taxes. And the whole point of those taxes being to fund the Roman military, which is what provides the peace that enables you to live a peaceful life. I mean, that's the great boast of the Roman Empire, is peace and security, is that we have provided for you a peaceful, secure situation that as long as you're living within the boundaries of the Roman Empire, you're going to be okay. You're not going to be facing war. You're going to live in relative peace and, well, hopefully some level of prosperity that comes with peace. So you're welcome, says Rome. That's what we're providing for you. But that's what the Roman Empire is ultimately about. So importantly, just keep the peace. That's it, right? Don't commit and don't do anything that would threaten to undermine what makes Rome what it is. And really what Rome strives for, what the ancient world ultimately strives for, but certainly what Rome strives for is concordia. It strives for harmony in the Greek. It's this idea that everybody is living in harmony or in concordia to the extent that there's no trouble, there's no people, hurting one another or particularly trying to threaten the Roman Empire. That's really what it comes down to. Don't threaten the Roman Empire. Don't do anything that's insurrection-y, for example, preaching that this Jesus that was crucified is actually the Messiah, that's actually a king, Lord and Savior. Don't do that kind of stuff because that's a threat to our stability. That's a threat to the emperor. Stop doing that or else we might have to come in there and punish you. So those are the rules of the road. That's what it means to be in an empire. And when it comes to keeping the peace, we don't care how you do that so long as you do that. And what Rome is really about is just minimal bureaucracy. Rome doesn't actually have a lot of people to run its empire. If you think about the size of the Roman Empire, it was about 50 million people, which doesn't sound like much, but when you consider that the Earth's population was about 100 million, basically Rome ran half the world. And it had an empire spanning from Britain all the way down into the Middle East. It was an enormous, enormous empire. They would have had that whole thing been running with maybe a few thousand bureaucrats. Right, a few thousand people to take care of the entirety of the Roman Empire. So this is an extraordinarily massive, complex system of an empire that they've got, and it's got a couple thousand bureaucrats. Now think about your local council. You've probably got a few thousand people working on that, and they still can't even get the roads or they can't even fix the potholes in the road. I mean, it's just terrible. And the Romans managed to do that. And so at the same time, what it meant was that the Roman Empire was constantly on the verge of chaos. It was only just being held together. It was, but only by the skin of its teeth. And so that was fine. That's kind of how the Romans like to do things. They like to keep the bureaucracy at an absolute minimal. And so what that means then instead is they get the locals to do the ruling for them, right? They get the local population to take care of themselves. That way, there at least seems to be a semblance of autonomy, right? You're your own people, that's fine. You've got your own rulers and you've got your own whatever magistrates you want. Again, just make sure that those guys keep the peace and pay the taxes. Everything else is fine. So if you think about King Herod, for example, you read about in the New Testament, what's King Herod's role? Well, he's just Rome's man in Jerusalem. He's Rome's man in Israel. He's there to look after the people, and his job is twofold: keep the peace and pay the taxes. Because the Romans know that if they come in with a Roman king, that's not going to go down well at all. I mean, Herod was never accepted anyway. He was Rome's puppet, but at least he was Jewish. And so then later on, you've got the Sanhedrin. Jesus stands before the Sanhedrin. Paul later on, the same thing. What is their role? And the high priest over them, what's their role? Their job is to maintain the peace and keep to collect the taxes. That's what they do. So the high priest is effectively the ruler of the people of Judea. And so the point being that Rome is very, very happy to rule through those people, and they have the responsibility of dealing with local issues. The only thing that they can't deal with are capital crimes, which is to say killing somebody, right? So, when they're bringing Jesus before Pilate, he's like, no, you guys deal with this yourself. You've got your own courts. Take this to them. Deal with this yourselves. And they say, yes, we can't execute anybody, and that's why we need you here, Pilate. So that's where Rome will intervene. And the only reason that Rome would ever execute a person is because they're an insurrectionist. And by that, I mean they're a threat to Rome. That's really the only crime that we ever deal with. When it comes to the Roman criminal system, there's only one thing that any sort of state court is ever going to be interested in, and that is anything that threatens the stability of the empire, stability of the Roman people. In fact, there was a name for this particular crime, which is the Latin word majestas. Now, what that refers to is, think about where we get our word majesty from. For Rome, they had always understood themselves as being superior, and frankly, they were. I mean, they had an empire that lasted for 1,000 years and spanned all of Europe, most of Asia. It was an enormous, enormous empire. So they've got something to boast about. But what made them, in their own minds, superior was their majesty, their majestas. It was this idea that they were supreme. It was almost like they were endorsed by the gods to be this incredible people that they were. And so their majestas was what needed to be protected. That was the thing that made them so superior. And so long as that majestas was maintained, then they would continue on as they were. So anything that threatened that, anything that threatened the majesty and the glory and the superiority of Rome was a threat. You were a public enemy number one. And so that's when we get interested, right? That's when the state will start to prosecute a person, because you're a direct threat to the state itself. So when it comes to individual crimes, that's between you guys. When the only thing we pay attention to is anything that directly threatens us. That's when we start to bring our court systems into play, and that's when you're going to start to see people getting punished, and up until the point of even crucifixion. So what that then leaves you with is a situation where any sort of private matter, well, that's for you to deal with. Anything that is between families or even within small groups, that's for you guys to deal with. That's why you guys sort that stuff out yourself. And so one of the ways that you minimize bureaucracy in an empire is that you don't have a police force. You don't need a police force because you've got the people to look after themselves. We will take care of matters that affect us, the state. We will come after you for anything that is, treason. But when it's a private matter, you guys deal with that yourself. And you say, well, hang on, what is the incentive then? Why would you deal with these private matters? Well, because you're living in an honor-shame society. If somebody threatens you or attacks your family, your honor determines that you would go after that person, that you would bring about some sort of justice. You would prosecute that person to whatever your abilities would be. You would take them to the courts. Again, the courts don't come after you. There's no state prosecution that would come after somebody who's a private citizen who's done something to another private citizen. But the private citizens can use the courts to bring about justice that has been committed against their family. So they will do the work of doing that. But at the same time, in a family, if, for example, my son was to murder the son in another family, that's shameful to me. If they've done something that is just murder, there's no reason for it, they've just done something terrible, that's a mark on my family name. And so I have an obligation to the honor of my family to deal with my son. And so then in those situations, two families would mediate the situation, and an appropriate punishment implemented by me would be enough to settle that situation. We don't have to take this to the courts because it's just a private matter. And so what that means then is that the role of the family, and particularly the role of the father, one of the primary roles of the father, in fact, was to deal with the family members whenever they broke the law or did anything that would honor the family. In fact, the Roman father had the legal power of life and death over his children. If his children did something that would bring shame on the family, he had the legal right and really an obligation to kill the children if it came to that. That's the extent of his power. And not only would nobody complain or say anything negative about the father for doing that. In fact, the father would be honored for killing even his own children if it meant maintaining his honor. Honor was so much more important than anything else in this world that if the family member does that, then you kill them. It's as simple as that. Now, it doesn't mean that ever happened much. It did happen on occasion, but if it never, for the most part, never actually got to that point. But if it should, then the father has the legal right to do that. So in other words, what that means is that the families themselves were empowered to do the work of any sort of criminal proceeding. And when it comes to private matters, then that's what the families are there to do. Now, if that son had threatened to kill the emperor, that's a different story. Now Rome is going to come after you and come after the son, and there's nothing you can do about it at that point. But when it's a private matter, that's how you deal with this. But there was another context in which these sort of criminal matters could be dealt with, and that was within organizations. So I said to you, in the case of the Jewish people, Rome again is happy for the local populations, say for example the Jewish people, to deal with their own problems. In places like Corinth, for example, you have synagogues. Now the synagogue is where the Jewish people come to meet, and that's where the Jewish community does its thing. They come there on Sabbath to hear Torah. The kids go there for school. They have any sort of festivals and meals there. Like, that's the place where the Jewish community comes together to do their thing. But one of the things that will happen in a synagogue is that if there is any sort of dispute or any sort of criminal proceeding amongst the Jewish community, an internal Jewish matter, we will deal with that in the synagogue. And so I've talked about this before, but you think about Paul receiving the 40 lashes minus one on 5 different occasions. What was that? That's a Jewish punishment given by the synagogue for being an apostate, for preaching Jesus Christ. And so the Jewish people, Paul has committed a crime against the Jewish people. That's not a Roman matter. The Romans don't care about that stuff, but the Jewish people certainly do. So in those circumstances, the Jewish community has the right to punish them, and Rome will do nothing about that. Rome is very happy for that to happen. And particularly, they would be grateful that the community would deal with that, because if those disputes break out into some sort of trouble or even some sort of riot in amongst the Jewish people, then we've got a real problem, which is it's a threat to the peace. You're not keeping the peace. And so deal with those matters yourselves. Certainly don't let them escalate and become a state problem. And we're very happy for that to happen. In fact, the closest we get to this sort of situation happened in about 49 AD, which is when there was a dispute in the Jewish community that had blown up to an extent where that the Emperor Claudius actually just drove all the Jewish people out of Rome. You read about this in Acts 18. And so what seems to be happening there is that you've got probably a dispute between the Orthodox Jews and the Christian Jews, and it's come to such a hated exchange that Claudius has gone, you know what, I'm sick of the lot of you guys, get out of Rome. And so it only applied in Rome, but all of the Jewish people in Rome were kicked out as a way of, well, you guys haven't been able to deal with this dispute. Now we're going to have to step in because now you're threatening the harmony of Rome itself. He wasn't concerned one bit about the Jewish question, the question of Jesus or whatever it might be. His concern was Rome. And so at that point, that's when we need to step in and do something about this. And so then when it comes to matters of internal arbitration, that gets done by the local groups. And so this is and everyone's part of a group. They're always part of a family, obviously, but they might also be part of a synagogue if you're Jewish. Or in the case of just everybody else, you're part of some sort of association, some trade association. So these are very common as well. What you're going to find is that, so for Paul, he's a leather worker, for example. And wherever he goes, he can find an organization of leather workers. So when he comes to Corinth again, he meets Priscilla and Aquila. How does he meet them? Probably through the association. And so what this association is it's an organized group of all of the local trades of the people of the same trade. So in that case, being leatherworking, for example. And what that would look like is that you would pay a monthly membership fee, and what that fee would provide is that you can participate in the regular meal. So you can basically just come to the regular party, and it would also provide for you your burial rights. So if you die, which obviously everybody already does of course, and then particularly when everyone dies so young in the ancient world, we're going to take care of things. Burial is very, very important for the ancient people, and particularly if you don't have a family around, or if you do that maybe can't afford to bury you properly, we'll take care of that. And so they become something like a second family to the people in the society, something of a network of protection for the people within that same trade. Now, what we know from these organizations is that they have a set of charters, they have a set of laws, and these laws typically pertain to behavior at the meal. All right, these are the sort of behaviors that are forbidden at the meal, particularly fighting, for example. These are what your fees are going to be, and this is what happens to anyone who fails to pay the fees. Generally, that's generally what the laws relate to. Don't start fights at the meals, especially when you're drunk, and then don't forget to pay your fees. And pretty much that's as much as we can as we can control. That's as much as sort of say that we have over your life. Now, you do find examples in some groups where they'll have rules about, don't molest the wife of another member. Have respect for the family members of the members of this group. Basically see their family as your family. That's certainly rules around that as well. But one of the common rules that you find in these groups is, if there is an internal matter, don't take it to court. If somebody offends you, we will deal with that. We have our own systems to deal with that. And what that could look like would be, if it may be a minor offence, maybe they're forbidden from coming to the meal, for example. We've got ways to deal with members who hurt other members. And there's a lot of power that these groups have, primarily through ostracizing the person who's done whatever this thing is. That sort of punishment is extremely significant. To be ostracized from a group, the shame that comes along with that is absolutely significant. So we can threaten people with that. And that's a really important mechanism of control. If you fail to pay your fees, you can't come to the meal. If you can't come to the meal, you're going to have the shame of not being welcome at the meal of your own group. So there's a lot of control you have with ostracization. So if there are internal matters, it is essential that you don't take them to the courts. We will deal with this. Keep this matter in-house, because if it gets out that our group have these issues, that's very embarrassing. We don't want our we don't want our dirty laundry to be aired publicly. We want to make sure that we keep a face of solidarity. We want people to think that we're the best group, that we're the best association in town, that everybody wants to be part of our group. And the only way that we can maintain that facade is that we keep internal matters dealt with ourselves. And again, Rome is very happy for this to continue, because whatever matters would be dealt with within the group are matters that relate directly to the group. Now, if there was a case of two members who are having a dispute, and that might be over something that's unrelated to the association itself, but they're two members of this group, then the group itself in those situations can take care of the matter, because it affects two of their members. And if this thing blows up, it's going to look bad on us. So we will deal with this ourselves. And so it becomes sort of its own judicial system within the empire that can deal with members. And it has a very powerful mechanism of discipline, which again is ostracizing. If you are removed from the group or punished by that group, that is humiliating for you. And that's the last thing you want to have happen. So what do? Toe the line. Don't break the rules. It's as simple as that. Don't be the sort of person that brings shame onto yourself and onto the group, and everything will be okay. So the really important thing to recognize here is that the Romans expect that the groups will deal with stuff themselves, to the extent that the groups will say, do not go to the courts, because that's going to be very embarrassing for everybody. Deal with it yourself. And if you do happen to take things to the courts, there's only one possible incentive for that, is that you want to embarrass the other person and you want to embarrass the group. And so therefore, we are going to punish you for having the audacity to bring shame on all of us. You'll be removed from the group for bringing to court the thing that actually was against you. So that's kind of the big picture then of what the of how matters were dealt with, which basically leaves the courts really only for cases of state prosecution, in the sense that you have committed something, some sort of crime that is a threat to the stability of the city. And whenever you see Paul getting dragged up to court, it's always over matters of that Paul is perceived to be or presented to be some sort of threat to the Roman Empire. So that's where we see that sort of thing happening. The only other reason then that you would use the courts is that you wanted to publicly humiliate somebody. So the courts, again, they're only ever there to be used by the state to prosecute criminals who've threatened the public order. And for the majority of the people anyway, if it's left to the local population to prosecute crimes committed against them, so let's just say, you've murdered somebody in my family, I can prosecute you. I can take you to court if, to have some sort of justice be served. But that assumes I can afford to go to court in the first place. I would have to provide the lawyers. I would have to do the work of prosecution or find a lawyer that can do that. That's a very expensive process that I don't have the money or the time to do. I'm too busy working 7 days a week to pay for my family to have food. And so I can't afford courts. I don't have the time to do that. I've just got to let this thing slide. So very few people actually have the resources to use the courts at all anyway, which means that the only time courts ever going to be used for any sort of private matter is only ever going to be for high status people, for upper class, high status, wealthy people. So much so, in fact, that if I, as a low status person, this is the other thing to note about the court system, is that they're very much geared towards status. So if you're a high status person, automatically you are better off than a low status person. As a high status person, you can expect that any crimes you commit will be overlooked. To as much as possible, they'll be overlooked. And even if we have to find you guilty, you're going to get less of a punishment. So, for example, if a low status person, when I say low status, somebody who's very poor, somebody who is a working class, or basically a hand worker, or somebody who is of no consequence, if they commit a low-level crime, they can expect some sort of corporal punishment, some sort of flogging up until the point of death by crucifixion. A high-status person who does exactly the same thing barely gets a slap over the wrist. They can just carry on as they are. If in the example that I, as a low-status person, have had a crime committed against me by a high-status person, if I was to take that person to court, I would actually be punished, or the courts or the judge would look at me as somebody who has done the wrong thing for having the audacity for bringing this person to court in the first place. I have threatened the honor and the dignity of this high status person by bringing them to court. That's a mark against my name. And so I can expect, to an extent, to even be punished for having the audacity to do that in the first place. So all that to say that for the majority of people, even if they could take these matters to court, they wouldn't have the resources to do it. And as low status people, nobody would take them seriously anyway. So basically what that leaves us with then is a court system that is only ever been accessed and utilized by high status people. It's as simple as that. And again, when it comes to threats against the society, threats against the Roman Empire, that's only ever really going to come from a high status person. A low status person who is just not a threat. That's just they're not a concern for Rome. We can just punish them, whatever. But they're not really seen. They're never really taken very seriously. It's only ever going to be high status people who are either seen as a threat or that have the resources to utilize the courts in the first place. Now, there's one more dimension to this that's absolutely essential for our story, and that is that public courts are public, in that they're done in the open. Think about the times when Paul is brought up in front of the judges. So we see it in Acts 16, we see it again in Acts 18 in Philippi, that in Corinth. They bring him to the magistrate, but they bring him out into the forum. They actually literally bring him out into the public square because that's where courts are held. When you go to Rome, there are, I think, 6 different courts that Rome has, and all of them are public. When a court case is happening, it's a public spectacle. Everybody turns out to see it. It's sporting, it's entertainment, and particularly because these great orators, we talked last week about how good the orators were of their time. How they made a name for themselves was often in the law courts. We talk again. I listened to last week's episode about how orators get trained. When you're being trained in oratory, you're being trained in law. You're going to become a lawyer, and one of the ways that you're going to make a name for yourself is in the courts, because all of these courts are done in public. Everybody can see how good you are, and if you always win your cases, then you're going to become very famous as being a great orator who always wins. So courts are a public matter. Everybody sees what's going on, and so everybody knows the goss. Everybody knows what everybody's doing and what crimes have been committed and who's doing what to who, because it's all done in public. It's literally done in the public square. So courts are a public thing, which means that if you're clever about it, you don't have to be clever, it's sort of common sense, you could use the courts to your advantage to bring shame on another person. If this court case is going to be dealt with publicly, that gives me an opportunity to bring somebody to court who I just want to slander. Right? So I've got some person who is an up-and-coming star in the city, some young man who is very wealthy, very articulate, and he's becoming very popular, right? And, I'm the most famous person in the city. I've got the best reputation. I'm seen as the best orator. And so somebody is now threatening my status as being supreme, as being the greatest person, the greatest man in the city. Well, I need to cut that person down a few pegs. Right? In an honor-shame society, shame is the way that you deal with other people that are a threat to you. You bring shame on them, and that has to get done publicly. Think about the times when you've got these synagogue leaders who are coming out and they're questioning Jesus doing miracles on the Sabbath or whatever he might be doing. And they publicly call him out. They say to the crowds, hey, if you've got a problem, come on any other day but the Sabbath to get healed. Don't come on the Sabbath and disgrace the Sabbath by making this man work. Like, they're just trying to publicly shame Jesus. They don't care one whit about what Jesus is doing. They just want to cut him down a few pegs because he's a threat to their status. People are coming to listen to him and not to him and not to you. Well, you've got to cut that guy down. It's no different in any of these ancient cities. If somebody is a threat to your status, to your position, you want to cut them down. And the best possible way you can do that is to drag them through some scandalous lawsuit or some scandalous criminal proceeding that might maybe stick and maybe just knock them down in the public opinion. Because it's not even about whether they've done anything wrong. It's whether people think they've done something wrong. And that's all that really counts. And so you'll find some sort of frivolous charge that's not even true. But it's like one of those situations where if you can just throw enough mud, maybe eventually some of it will stick. And that's what you're going for here. You just got to throw mud and hopefully some of it will stick. And so really all you're trying to do is to cut this person down in the public view. You want this person to be publicly seen as, well, just a bad person. And just do enough to slander their reputation, even if later on they were to come back and recover and prove that they're innocent and that actually this was a false accusation, they never fully recover. I mean, we still see the same thing today. Right? How many times have we heard about somebody who has been sued for something or they've been charged with some crime, and they're dragged through the courts and it's in every magazine and it's all over the news. This person has been charged with this. They're not found guilty yet, but this is what they've been charged with. And so all these court systems drag on. And over time, their name is just dragged through the mud until eventually you can't see that person without being associating them with this thing. And there's a part of us, there's sort of a cruel part of us that we want to see it happen. We want people to be cut down because it makes them more at our level. It's just something vindictive about all of us, I think, as humans, that we like to see this. We want to hear the goss, if nothing else, but really what we want to have happen is this person to be less than us. We like the idea that we're morally superior to this person who everybody loved and adored, and this was such a wonderful person, and now the real person's come out. And so now I feel better because I'm morally superior to this other person. And so we love it. It's just something we just we just want to have more of. We just feast on it. And so you think about news, it's always negative. It's always ugly. It's always the worst of society because we just want that. It's just something about us that needs that. It's kind of sick when you think about it. But at any rate, you go through this whole proceedings and then a year down the track, countersuits and all these things go on, and it comes out that person in fact was innocent the whole time, that they never committed that crime, that nothing of what was said about them was in any way, shape or form true, but by now it's too late. It doesn't matter anymore. If only because that news doesn't get reported, because no one wants to hear that the good guy, that person was actually a good person. We just want the bad news. And so that stuff, it's always on the back page of whatever outlet. No one cares about the good side of it. So that never really sees the light of day. But even if somebody was to, even if it was to get out, hey, no, this person was innocent, they never did it, then they're so tarred with that reputation now that it's impossible to see them as anything else. We've become so convinced that they are this terrible person that we thought they were. Yeah, they might be, somebody's found them innocent. I'm sure that judge was probably bribed. Or, I'm sure that was just some patriarchal thing that has caused that person to be seen as being innocent, or whatever we can put it down to. We just don't want the truth. We don't want to see that person for what they actually are. And even if we were to go, yeah, all right, I'm sure they were innocent, but you could see them being capable of it, couldn't you? You could see them as possibly, that's something that person could potentially do. So you know what? I'm probably leaning towards actually they did it, but there's been a cover-up or some sort of conspiracy. You know what I mean? You see these situations happening all the time, and, well, that person's life is ruined. At the end of the day, what it comes down to, that person's life has now been ruined. They're never going to recover from whatever this scandal was. And, well, that's just how it is from now. They've been cut down, or they've been shamed, or they've been cancelled, as we would say in today's culture. So we see that all the time. That's age-old human behaviour. Because what used to happen in these courts is that one high-status person would take another high-status person to court, knowing that everybody's going to see it and everybody's going to participate in the proceedings, and you bet they're going to be gossiping about it. Even if they don't get to see the court case, that is going to spread like wildfire. Oh, that person that we thought was fantastic, turns out he's not. Turns out that person's terrible. This lawsuit that's been thrown against them, and they're so bad, and all of this. Again, later on, it might be found out they're innocent, but by that point, their reputation is mud, and it's just never going to fully recover. All that to say is that quite often, that's what the courts are used for. Quite often what will happen is that you'll get these elites taking one another to court for the same reason that we would publicly slander somebody today. We just simply want to make them look stupid. We want to be seen to be better than that person, and that's exactly what we're going to find happening in these court cases. So what has that got to do with Corinthians? Well, when you think about the Corinthian church, don't think about this great big congregation that meets regularly in an auditorium. They weren't even a big church to begin with. I mean, at the most, they might have been 50 or 60 people, so still a very small group. But it's not like they were just this one big group that met in the same hall every week. One, they didn't have halls to meet in. What they were families. They were a series of, a network of maybe 4 or 5, at their earliest time, maybe 4 or 5 families who met regularly as families, and maybe once a month at the most, maybe got together as a whole group in some rented space somewhere. But that wasn't their regular thing. If you think about churches where you've got a lot of small congregations around a city, and every now and again you all come together and you have one big service where all the churches come together. Think about the Corinthian church like that. Think about them as a series of families who every now and again come together to be the Church of Corinth, the quote-unquote Church of Corinth, but otherwise they're just the church of whoever the head of the house was, whoever the owner of that particular house was. Now, what that means then is that you've got a church made up of groups that have their own pre-existing loyalties, right? The thing about being part of a family is that is your central group. And remember, that's the group that you take care of internal matters. Your family is your whole world. And so whatever loyalties you have, you're bringing those loyalties into the church, to the extent that you've got families who would maybe have animosity towards other families because my family needs to be the best family. My family needs to have the best reputation. And if there's another family that is increasing in their reputation, I'm going to cut those people down a little bit. I want to make sure that my family is seen to be the best because it's in an honor shame society. It's very competitive. It's about being seen to be the best. So when Paul starts his churches, he starts them amongst existing groups that have their own pre-existing loyalties, pre-existing biases, and in some cases, pre-existing animosities. Families in some sort of enmity relationship with another family, very, very common. And so what Paul's trying to do is to overcome that by giving them all this shared identity. You are all one in Christ. You're all a family, a body in Christ. You've got to see past these divisions that you have, these family divisions that you have. You need to see yourselves as one and the same thing. That's easier said than done. That's just something that for all of time, as long as they can remember, they've always done family this way. And now overnight, you've got to start to see all these other families as one great big family. That's harder than it might look. And what that's going to mean is that even in this new church of Corinth, these loyalties are going to remain. And we see that already. We see the divisions going on in Corinth. I follow Paul. I follow Apollos. What's that about? Well, those are the different groups who are forming their own have already got their own identities, but forming them again around who their favorite teacher is. And so what seems to be happening in Corinth is that these court cases are probably taking place between the different groups. One member from one group, maybe the head of one of the groups, is taken to court a member of another group, because they're not going to take their own groups to court because that's literally their family, right? That group is their most loyal group. They're not taking a member of their household to court. They're taking a member of another household to court because that's just what they do. That's how this world has always worked. This is nothing new for them. The problem now is that they're doing it in the Christian context. They're doing it in a context where they're supposed to see each other as one whole family rather than a group made up of individual families. So let's have a look at the passage again in light of all of this and just see what it sort of reveals. So it says, if anyone has a dispute with one another, do you dare take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the Lord's people? Or do you not know that the Lord's people will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? So an important question that he asks there is, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Now, what does that tell us? Number one, these cases are trivial. They're not actually serious crimes that have been committed here. We're probably just talking about, at the most, maybe a civil case or maybe a lawsuit or something. But what we're really probably dealing with actually is just a dispute between two families that's been escalated to court. That's probably what all of this boils down to. And so Paul's shocked at the fact that it's got that far. He says, surely somebody there could have dealt with this. And that's true. Some of them could have. If they're educated, they've been trained in law, they know if it is an actual legal matter, they could absolutely deal with this themselves as trained lawyers. That's part of their capacity. Paul's saying, why aren't you dealing with this yourself? Remembering that in these associations and these sorts of groups, it's expected that you deal with these matters privately, that you take the two parties that are having a dispute and you mediate it behind closed doors as a group to make sure that this doesn't get out. Paul's shock is not just the fact that they have these cases to begin with, it's that they're taking them to the public courts. They should be dealing with this in-house because they're qualified to do it and because what they're dealing with are pathetic matters. They're actually non-issues. It's just almost certainly a case of one believer taking another believer to court for the express purposes of shaming that other person. So it says, verse 4, therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, do you ask for a ruling from those whose way of life is scorned by the church? I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody amongst you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers, but instead one brother takes another to court, and this in front of unbelievers? So again, the question is, surely there's somebody there that can deal with this. And there was. That's the crazy part. There were people in the church that could deal with this. And instead, Paul says, you take this before the ungodly. You take these matters before those who aren't even part of the community, and you have them judge it. But even worse than that, you're taking it to the public courts. This has been dealt with out in the public forum. You can still go today to the seat of judgment, the Bema seat in Corinth, where this thing would have happened, right in the middle of the forum, in the busiest part of town. These matters would have been dealt with, and everyone would go, hang on, aren't those the Christians? Right? Aren't those the guys that are supposed to be brothers in Christ? And yet look at what they're doing to each other. What a stupid situation. And Paul notes this. He says one brother takes another brother to court. I mean, if it's bad enough that two members of an association were to take another member to court, how much worse is it than when a family member takes another family member to court? This is one of the almost a crime in itself. It's one thing to have a family member commit a crime, but for a family member to take another family member to court, a brother take a brother to court, that in and of itself is just a shameful act. The fact that you're even doing this is just a shame to your whole family. You just don't do that. It's just not something that gets done. And so Paul's language is about as harsh as it can get. It's a brother taking another brother to court. This is as bad as it can possibly get. It's just quite astounding to me that this is even happening in the first place, and that you've got people in the church that could deal with this, but you're refusing to do that. And now why would they be refusing to do that? Why would they not be dealing with this behind closed doors in a society where everybody's expected to deal with it behind closed doors? Why wouldn't they? Well, because they don't want to deal with it. It's not a matter that they want to deal with at all. They want the shame. They want the scandal. They want the other person to be seen to be made to look stupid. Otherwise, they would deal with it because it would be a serious issue. It's not a serious issue. This is a case where one Christian wants to make the other Christian look as stupid as possible, and to do that as publicly as possible in front of the whole world for their own benefit, for their own glory, for their own satisfaction, to boost their own status at the expense of what is supposed to be a brother in Christ. So he finishes verse 7, the very fact that you have lawsuits amongst you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers and sisters. This is just as bad as it can possibly get. The fact that you even have lawsuits amongst yourselves tells me you're already defeated. I'm questioning whether you guys are even Christians anymore, that you've even got these matters to begin with, and that the way that you're dealing with them is as anti-Christian as you could possibly be. It is just as bad as it could possibly get. That you are doing wrong to one another. It's insanity. I'm shocked. Paul says. I honestly, I'm just even wondering, are you guys even Christian anymore? That's as bad as this has got. So I started with the questions to begin with. Are we Corinth? And then the second question of, should we be doing what the Corinthians are doing? So let's start with the first question. What is it that the Corinthians are actually doing? Well, they're just publicly shaming one another. There's no actual case going on here. It's just one Christian trying to make a fool of another Christian. That's all of this, what this comes down to. And they're doing it through the public courts. They're doing it in the courts of public opinion. Now, we don't have courts done out in the middle of a public square, right? You don't go to the middle of a CBD somewhere and you see a court case being held out there for all of the public, all of the pedestrians walking past to stop and have a look. Obviously, that doesn't happen anymore. Courts get done privately behind closed doors. So what is the equivalent here? Well, the equivalent here, the public square, as it were, in today's world is social media. We live in a world where we can vent our opinions and for the whole world to see, and at any time and any time we like. And so what these Corinthians are doing is just taking their grievances out into the public square, or in our case, taking them out to social media. So then the question is really, how do we as Christians talk about other Christians on social media? Because that's what the equivalent is. If we've got a grievance with another Christian, there's nothing to do with a criminal case at all. There's nothing criminal about it whatsoever. It's just, I don't like this person, or I want to make this person look stupid, or whatever it might be. And so rather than deal with it behind closed doors, rather than, just try to find some sort of resolution, and maybe even try to find a place of forgiveness, or a place of friendship or relationship. No. What I want to do instead is make this person look stupid as publicly as I possibly can. So I'm going to take this to social media. I'm going to embarrass this person as much as I can and as publicly as I can through this mechanism of the town square, which is social media. So to the question of, are we Corinth? Well, yeah. Have you been on social media? Have you seen the way that Christians talk about other Christians on social media? Maybe you're even that person. Maybe you're the person who uses social media as a mechanism to talk badly about other Christians. That's what these Corinthians are doing. And Paul looks at those guys and he says, I'm wondering if you guys are even saved anymore, the way that you're treating your so-called brothers and sisters. So that then brings us to the second question of, should we be doing what the Corinthians were doing? I.e., with an original understanding of, should we not be going to court? Well, obviously that's not what Paul's talking about. But to the question of, should we be doing what the Corinthians are doing? Absolutely not. That's absolutely the last thing that we should be doing. Again, nothing to do with criminal proceedings. If an actual crime has been committed by a Christian, it is not the church's job to protect that person or to deal with it themselves. It is the church's job to bring that person to justice. If there is particularly in the case of somebody who is maybe molesting children in a church, no, it's not the church's job to cover that over and deal with it or send that person to another parish or however that's being dealt with. No, it's the church's job to bring that person to court and to see justice be served. That is what is meant to happen in those circumstances. Absolutely, that is not what Paul is talking about here. What we're talking about is just simply, again, publicly humiliating another Christian. Paul would say, if it even gets to that, if that's what you guys have devolved into, I'm wondering if you guys are even saved anymore. Absolutely not. That is not what you should be doing at all whatsoever. So are we Corinth? Unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, that is still a lot of this sort of stuff going on. It takes a different form, unrecognizable to what Paul's talking about, but the attitude, the heart behind it, and ultimately just the behavior hasn't changed. And so again, unfortunately, we still resemble the Corinthian church in so many ways. But if with that in mind, at the same time, we've also got Paul's instruction as to how we should be responding when these situations arise. But anyway, that's enough for this week. I hope that's been helpful. Have a great week, and I will see you next week. All the best.